Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of KerVAM. We are back with a sort of more unusual episode today. Of course, recently we've been talking about collection box sets and animations upcoming and things like that, but we decided today was a good opportunity to, as there's not anything immediately on the horizon. I know Web of Fear is coming out in a week or two, but there's nothing immediately on the horizon. We thought we'd take a little look back at a rather interesting, I guess, general topic, really, because it's the many releases of Shada. Obviously, Shada, as well, some of you know, was a Doctor Who story that was ultimately never made back in 1979 for season 17. We'll come on to more details as to exactly where it all went wrong later on in the podcast. But it has been a story that has basically been tried to be remade many times over and over and over. So we're going to cover them all off. Talk about some of the better ones, some of the worst ones, because there are many versions of Shada. And of course, I've got my two friends with me here to chat about it all and discuss it all, Ryan and Charlie. How are you guys getting on?
Doing very well, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm doing fine, thanks. I've been watching the two releases of Shada that I have, the 2013 DVD and the 2017 animation.
Fantastic. So we'll have some knowledge and some insight, which is always really good. I feel like we've, between us, we've all kind of somewhat seen pretty much all the versions of Shada. So hopefully we can give you guys a good impression of, where the story has taken us over, ultimately the best part of 40 years, because obviously it was, 42 years was when the original Shada was in production. So we might as well come on and start to talk about that. So Shada, of course, was a story for season 17 of Doctor Who. It was supposed to originally be the final story of the season, a big six-parter written by Douglas Adams, of course, who you all know, who wrote City of Death and The Pirate Planet as well. Quite famous for that, and obviously Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which maybe you're more familiar with as well. And so he was asked to come up and write the finale of the season, Shada, which ultimately was never made for, several reasons, but obviously the most kind of publicised and obvious one was a BBC strike at the time, which meant I believe they couldn't get the correct opportunities to get into the studio and just actually complete the filming of it. Ryan, I believe you've been reading up a little bit on some of the problems for the production back in 1979. What did you find out?
Well, basically what happened was... basically back then the BBC was very strongly unionized and everyone was very protective of their respective roles within the company. So if, for example, if you were wanting to kind of move things around, if the production team, if the staff liked you, then they would say, we would help you move this and we'll sort this out for you. But if you didn't get on with them or were just not on friendly grounds, then if you decide to do something that was within someone else's job, they would walk off on set. So it was very unionized, and this all came to a head in 1979 when there was a children's show called Play School, and there was this grand piece. It was like this sort of clock, I think, or timepiece. But the thing is, it's run by electricity, but it's also a prop as well. So there was a point of contention between the electrician department and the props department about whose job it was to maintain this. And as a result, it caused the staff to go on strike, which caused, and because they couldn't resolve the dispute, it caused the BBC to cause all the studios to shut down. And Doctor Who was one of the casualties, and they halted filming of Shada halfway through, or maybe it was more than halfway through into its production cycle.
Indeed, it's fair to say when you watch the various versions of it that it was the sort of later stages of the story that were much more impacted in terms of just simply, the recording not being there because the later studio scenes were just not able to be filmed. So a lot of the climax of the story just was never made ultimately. And as you say, there was this fascinating sort of, in retrospect, I guess, fascinating dispute because as you say, the BBC was so unionised, and just ridiculous, disputes over whether, that person was allowed to pick up that chair because they don't work for the right departments, they're not allowed to touch it. And if they are, they're putting somebody else out of a job, and it all came to a head, as you say, over this sort of weird clock thing. So it's it's in many ways it's remarkable that this was the only story that didn't get made back in sort of that period of Doctor Who history and BBC history, because there was a lot of strikes, a lot of union action around that sort of time. Obviously this came to an absolute head here, but I know there's certainly a fair few other stories where strikes did have some form of an impact on them. Ultimately though, only Shada was the one that was actually affected by it. And so obviously we left, the story never got aired because it wasn't able to be finished. There wasn't the money left to go back and do it and whatever. And so, that at the time was kind of it. It meant that season 17 ended with the Horns of Nimon, which, well, Charlie, how do you view the Horns of Nimon as a, ending to a season? Do you think it's a good final story?
Honestly, I don't think it's a good story in general. I watched it once as soon as I got it. I think it wasn't long before we recorded the first episode of this podcast, and
yes,
I genuinely remember practically nothing about it. Like, I just remember it's got Nimon, which is obviously the Minotaur, the Fourth Doctor, and Romana, and that's it. I don't remember anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the sort of story that you just kind of have to laugh at. It makes you question, how many Nimons have I seen today? My dreams of conquest, and the phenomenal performance from, wasn't it Graham Crowder, who's just, it's a wonderful performance. It's remarkable, really. It's one of those Doctor stories that you can't take seriously. You've just got to laugh at. But certainly at the time, it isn't the way you want to end a season. I think that's fair to say. As much as I know, Charlie, you do quite enjoy season 17, I don't think that this is probably one of the best parts of it, is it?
No, it's not really.
Exactly. So obviously Shada was kind of left there, and yeah, it wasn't made. It was left. The film cans were all existing. All the footage was there, but it was just left in the BBC archives or whatever to really never have a thought about it again. Until, well, we came to a few years later, and John Nathan Turner, looking for any opportunity to make a little bit of money that he can, but also he was, of course, a big Doctor Who fan. He saw that there's this story, Charlotte, that wasn't made, literally just before he came in, obviously, to the production team. But it was the final story before he took the role on in 1980 with the Leisure Hive. And he saw an opportunity to create a VHS release with bringing Tom Baker back in to get him to do narration, and set up in some sort of museum or some Doctor Who museum or something. Do we know where his linking narration was, where he filmed that? Do we actually know where that was? Was it the Longley exhibition, or did that not exist there anymore?
I think it might have been Longley, or it might have maybe got moved to London. I'm not entirely sure, but it was definitely an exhibition that was still open around that time.
Yeah, exactly. And so they decided that, the best way to do it would be to create linking narration and just release what was there, because, in many ways it was like a missing episode of Doctor Who, because, it was a load of Doctor Who that was filmed, but no one had ever seen it. And so it kind of starts us off on our journey exploring different versions of Shada and how they existed. So obviously this was the first one, the 1992 VHS release, which I believe was then released on DVD in, was it the 2013 Legacy Collection? I think that might be when it was released as well. Yes.
I think it was when they were running out of classic Doctor Who stories to release, and so they thought, well, let's just release that version of Shada.
Yeah, who needs to jazz it up? Let's just chuck it on a DVD and release it. That's all you need to do, isn't it, really? Yes, and I mean, it's a good way of getting everything out there, and obviously was before the days of animation being possible, so there wasn't really a lot else you could do with it. I guess they could have, restaged the scenes, or they could have done audio only for some of the scenes or whatever. But I think, Charlie, I believe you've seen this version of Shada. How does it kind of, I don't know, how are you able to follow on the story, or is the narration kind of, trying to plug two big gaps?
I do agree with the latter that you said, Elliot. It's a nice way to actually release the content rather than it just being on some random website. It's a nice way to actually access it. But at the same time, obviously most of the missing content is in episodes 3 through 6, which is a shame because it was building up quite a lot in the first 2 episodes, and it just feels like a tiny bit of a letdown, especially when you consider that this was the last 6-parter ever. And I always love the 6-part format, so it was just kind of a shame the last 4 episodes are only really half there.
Yeah, exactly. In many ways, it was quite a significant story for that reason, because for whatever reason, John Nathan Turner decided he didn't want to stick with six-parters anymore. And so, as you say, Charlie, this was the final use of a six-part structure for a Doctor Who story, albeit it was never made. So I guess the Invasion of Time would be officially the last six-part story. No, not the Invasion of Time, Armageddon Factor. Sorry, Armageddon Factor, the end of season 16. Wow, nearly got that one wrong. I don't know. Right, Ryan, what do you think of this 1992 version? I just, all I remember of it really is Tom Baker just going Shada all over the place. Isn't that how it starts or something? Isn't it? I believe.
Yeah, that's how it starts.
That I feel like that's the most iconic part of it. But what else
Mm.
do you remember from this version of Shada?
Well, apart from that amazing intro, nothing much. I mean, I can't be too critical because it was my introduction to Shada. That was basically how I got introduced, was through that version. What I do remember now, watching it now in comparison to the other versions, is the fact that they used, I believe it's called Kev McCullough, who did the music for the Sylvester McCoy era, and how much it really jars with the Tom Baker footage, because I always associate McCullough's music with McCoy's era. So seeing it with Tom Baker's footage from 1979 just feels so weirdly out of place and jarring. And I imagine it would have been much better if they had like Dudley Simpson, who was the composer back then, to do the music. And apart from that, I feel like they did do a reasonable job of linking it. I mean, I think Tom Baker was on good form, and he did a decent job of plugging in the gaps, even if it does feel very incomplete.
Yeah, I think that's always going to be the problem with something like that, is you're trying to, you have all these scenes of action and excitement and interest, and then you just cut to Tom Baker standing there going, and then this happened, and then this happened, and oh, let's join the adventure again. No matter how you kind of, frame that or write it or whatever, naturally it's going to become a bit, it's going to become a bit jarring. And I think in terms of probably the pacing as well, is a bit lacking. It just means you get these jumps that it kind of throws you out of the story a bit, as you say, particularly in the later episodes where it's more problematic. And also, yes, the slightly questionable decision to choose Kev McCullough to do the music, which just doesn't fit with Shada at all. It's very much a 70s Doctor Who story. It doesn't fit into the, even season 18, I don't think it doesn't feel like a season 18 story to me at all. It very much feels part of the season that it's in. And I think, obviously we'll come on to talk about the BBC Studios animation later on, but the score for that kind of suited the story a lot better, I think. Of course, we'll come on to that in due course. And so that kind of, it was the release. It was the way they were going to do it. They did it. And I guess that was kind of, they probably thought that's really it. Like, that was, mid VHS range. It was just an opportunity to release something else on VHS, fundamentally, among all the other stories that were being released at the time. And so probably in many ways, they didn't think there'd really be any other opportunity to do it. But then, of course, later on became Big Finish, and good old Big Finish Productions, who we love stories, who look for any opportunity to create any audio adventures to do with Doctor Who. And they decided, well, Shada was never actually made, so let's do an audio of it. And I believe they also combined it with a sort of flash animation that isn't really animation. I don't know, it's a bit questionable to call it animation, I feel, looking at some of it. But it is, there's pictures, it's sort of slideshows that move, kind of. And obviously they chose to use Paul McGann as the Doctor, I believe mainly because Tom Baker turned down the role. From what I've read, is that he, was approached because it would make the most logical sense to have Tom Baker do it, because it's, a Tom Baker story, but ultimately Paul McGann ended up doing it, like he did many a thing for Big Finish. And so they brought him in to do this. I don't know, have either of you ever actually sat down and watched this?
Yeah, I have seen it, and I think it is a solid attempt, even if it is a bit flawed. I mean, obviously, with it being rewritten to accommodate Paul McGann's Doctor, of course, they have to set it after. So at the beginning, we learned that Romana's suddenly the president of Gallifrey with K9, and he's there saying, "Oh, skip being the president for this while. I need you to come and help me do this." It feels a little bit like if you never heard of what happened with Romana in the audio dramas, it does become a little bit like, what? It's a bit strange. So I could definitely tell that it was definitely restructured just to accommodate Paul McGann's Doctor. But despite that, I feel like Paul McGann does a decent job in this story. Even and in a way, it offers a very interesting experiment, because often we hear like, what would this story be like with this certain Doctor, and so forth. And I feel like this was a nice little sort of deep dive into that. Even if it doesn't completely work, it's a sort of a nice way of addressing that question, that topic, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way to, answer that question, as you say, as much as they had to find slightly tenuous ways to make it actually work as a story, particularly as they still insist on having Romana in it and K9 and all of that, which was always going to be, a bit of a stretch. But yeah, it does answer that question. I mean, I don't know whether it answers the question that it's a good idea. I feel like a lot of adventures are made for that Doctor, and as much as we like to think, I don't know, what would Heaven Sent be like if it was David Tennant or Christopher Eccleston or something. Often I feel like they work best because they fit with that era and that Doctor in particular. I don't know, Charlie, have you ever had a chance to sort of have a look at this particular version in any way?
I have actually watched this version twice. Well, I watched the animation first, and like you said, it's not really an animation as such. It is more of just a moving PowerPoint.
Exactly.
And they did what they could for 2003. And it's not horrendous. And then I listened to the audio, and that I think was actually better because the writer Gary Russell, he added a sort of prologue before, sort of explaining why this has McGann, what's up with Romana. It kind of fills in the gaps that regular Whovians, the ones who don't listen to Big Finish, the stuff that they don't know. I think that helps, but also I do think the audio seems very dragged out because of the extended scenes that they do. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's, it was a good, I guess, experiment in some ways, because obviously they combined it with this sort of animation and meant they could release it on different formats. And, it wasn't just a Big Finish audio adventure. It was a bit wider, being able to experience more widely than that. And of course, this was in a time just before Doctor Who was brought back to television, and then things really changed and took off from there. I don't think that Doctor Who had been announced as returning by the time this was actually released. So it was very much, it was kind of a continuation of the Death Comes to Time, and I think it was called Real Time, those animations as well, around the similar time as Scream of the Shalka as well. All these sort of kind of experimental sort of animation-y things for Doctor Who that wasn't really quite there yet, but it just always, as Doctor Who has always been, really, it's always trying to do new and creative things, and so I do really appreciate that, them trying that, even if it doesn't necessarily work all that brilliantly. But I do believe you can still, certainly on the most recent animation release, you can definitely watch both the 1992 VHS version and the 2003 animation version. Those are both on that edition of Shada, or at least, yeah, I'm pretty sure they are. Maybe it's only the Steelbook, but definitely one of them has it on there. So that is always some way to check that out. Now, next we come on to, an animation that is extremely hard to actually watch because it's never been released. It doesn't, I guess in the BBC's eyes, it doesn't exist. Even more so than Shada as a television story doesn't exist. This is, of course, the 2010 animation by Ian Levine, the notorious figure in, the Doctor Who fandom. I don't know what we want to say about him, but he decided that he was going to make a version of Shada, an fully animated version. He was going to get in John Leeson to come and be the voice of K9, and some other chap I can't remember his name, to come and be the voice of the Doctor, because obviously they weren't going to get Tom Baker in. But John Leeson somehow had got on board to do this, and I don't know what they did about Romana. I'm not sure. Did they get Lalla Ward on board for this? I don't know.
I think they got Lalla Ward in. I imagine I think they did get her in.
Because I've read up on it a little bit, I can't quite understand exactly what the point of it was. Was it meant to be a bit of a kind of advertisement for the BBC, going, look, here, we made this animation. Why don't you go and commission it and, make it done professionally? Or was he just doing it for his own bit of fun? Because that's the sort of thing that he would do. I don't know. Do either of you guys have a theory on that?
I think I'm not entirely sure. I think he might have. I think he raised money to kind of do the animation and try and get it released properly so he could get Shada completed, I believe. But I think, because of how notoriously spoken out he is, and I imagine there was a lot of clashing of egos between him and the BBC, and so maybe that's why it never got released. I imagine that could be the reason why.
Indeed, yes. There seems to have been a lot of sort of, disagreements between him and the BBC, and not wanting to go ahead with stuff he's done. Obviously, he did an animation of Mission to the Unknown as well, I believe, back in the day, which I'm pretty sure I did watch at one point. I definitely haven't seen the Shada animation, only a few little brief clips of it. But I think it does maybe exist somewhere on the internet if you really, really, really go hunting. I know, Ryan, you said you've seen some clips of it. How is the animation itself? Like, how would you compare it to, well, I guess what we've seen in the past with the 2003 animation, but also the 2017 animation as well?
It's pretty decent. I think they did a good job of trying to capture the likenesses. The movement of the characters are a little bit stiff, but then again, I imagine he must have used more independent studio animation to accomplish this. So, and I know that they got someone to do an impersonation of Tom Baker for the Doctor. I'd imagine, and he was definitely a more decent sounding lookalike. Even there were times I'm thinking that's not really Tom Baker, is it?
Yeah.
I think the guy who played Tom Baker in it, he sounded like Tom Baker, but at the same time, like Ryan, you said, you could kind of tell it was similar to John Coleshaw as a Brigadier, say, in Big Finish, or the guy who plays the third Doctor, I can't remember his name. That sort of thing. Although I do quite like how he got Lalla Ward and John Leeson in. I have seen clips of it. And as for the animation, looking at it, then it's quite good for what's essentially a slightly more high-budget fan project. It does look really good, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, you can certainly see images of it and little clips of it and whatever, and they're available, they exist, and it doesn't look that bad. Like, sure, it's not on the level of the 2017 animation, but it's hardly a bad animation. I think it certainly, as you say, is better than just your average fan animation you see on YouTube, I think, in general. And the fact that, you're animating the whole rest of the story, which is still there was a reasonable chunk ultimately that wasn't there. So that was always going to be a challenge. I think, he did a fairly good job of it. I thought it was quite entertaining. I read on, I think it might be Wikipedia or TARDIS Wiki or something along those lines, that Ian Levine had, by invitation, sent a copy of the animation to a guy from Starburst magazine to be reviewed, so he could watch it and give it a review. And so if you're invited to, review it and given a copy especially, of course he's going to give it a 10 out of 10, which he did. Which I just found quite funny. If you're going to be invited to watch something, then obviously you're not going to slate it. So it just seemed a bit of a pointless review to give it a 10 out of 10, and say it's amazing version of Shada. I guess there's nothing to compare it against because there was no other animation. But still, I just found that quite funny reading up about that, really. And so that was another chapter in the saga of Shada. We've had VHS linking narration. We've had animations that don't even exist. We also had a book in 2012, a novelization written by Gareth Roberts. I will only briefly touch on this, but yeah, that was another way to experience Shada through a novelization. I don't know, have either of you ever read the book? I can't say I have personally.
I haven't read it, but I have heard from some people that they think it's the definitive version of Shada. I know there are some people who think that is the case because it feels more, because they think it's more streamlined, much more straightforward, and get rid of some padding here and there. And I think it's because of the fact that it's more streamlined that they think it's the definitive version of it. I mean, I haven't read it myself, but hearing that, it does have me somewhat interested in reading it one day, but I don't know, I have to wait and see. I mean, it's hard to imagine anything being the definitive version of it after watching the 2017 version.
Indeed, yes. I don't know, I can understand that kind of idea. I guess it's easier because it ultimately is, apart from completely different versions of the story, like with Paul McGann in it, it's the only version of Shada that is all in one kind of format and one medium, I guess, because you're going from animation to normal to animation again can be a bit jarring or change the pacing of it or whatever. And so, I guess a book could be seen as the ultimate version of it. I guess maybe a lot of people look at some of the Target novelizations as like their favorite version of, that classic Who story. So I don't think it's uncommon that novelizations are kind of seen as, almost the better version, but that's because you've got limitless opportunity, limitless imagination and worlds to create, and you know, you're not limited by a BBC budget, as they always say with novelization. So I think it's understandable that people can think that about it, and you know, that's like that certainly makes a lot of sense. I think. I don't know, Charlie, have you ever had any chance to tackle the novelization of Shada?
Unfortunately, I haven't, but I would really like to read it because I am a fan of the Target books. But at the end of the day, it's the same story, and they're really short. They're like 200 pages. I can get through one in like just a few hours, whereas this, I
Yeah,
believe, a good 400 pages, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe it's along those lines. Yes.
Yeah, and Douglas Adams, he's obviously known for his Doctor Who stories being very plot heavy and convoluted, and evidently he's much better at writing books. So I'm quite glad that although Douglas Adams didn't write this, that it was made into a book because I can imagine the plot suits it a lot better, seeing the actual story.
Yes, exactly. I think it. Yeah, certainly. Well, as you know, we'll finish off by discussing the actual story of Shada, but I think it's fair to say it's not the most straightforward, and it's a very Douglas Adams script, as you know, as it inevitably would be. And so, you know, that kind of brings us on to the, I guess, the biggest, most publicized version of Shada, which is, of course, the 2017 animation. Now, this I feel was maybe a little bit unexpected at the time. I mean, I guess in some ways the fact they'd started doing animations again kind of, you know, lent to the point of, oh, well, wouldn't it make sense to go and animate the rest of Shada? Like, that's a fairly obvious, easy thing to do. But I think because they were already getting into, you know, animating classic Who episodes again and doing, you know, missing episodes and whatever, it seemed maybe more logical at the time that they were just going to stick with Second Doctor animations or things like that, keep it simple. But obviously, Fourth Doctor story that doesn't really exist at all, and you can have it for the first time in 40 years complete, is naturally going to be a big selling point. And so we did in, I believe it's November 2017, we ultimately got the release of Shada, what I think the BBC would consider the definitive version of Shada, as we say, which sees the story in, you know, everything that was there is in there in HD on Blu-ray, or, you know, obviously on DVD as well, alongside proper animation for the rest of the story that's much in line with the missing episodes that we've seen animated both before and since then, along with all the audio obviously being re-recorded by Tom Baker, Lalla Ward, and the likes, people who were involved in the production at the time. I think the only thing that was a bit difficult was K9's dialogue because, you know, we didn't have David Brearley around to be able to do it with. And so that was very much, he barely says anything, basically, apart from the odd archive line, I think, essentially. But yeah, guys, the 2017 animation, what are your kind of, you know, first thoughts on it? Do you feel like it's the best version of Shada, Charlie?
Well, honestly, I've only seen the Paul McGann audio and animation, and I've also seen the VHS reconstruction. So, kind of by default, I do consider this the best and the definitive version.
Yeah.
I might think differently once I've read the book. I don't really know, but the animation itself, is actually quite good. I think in terms of the visuals and the actual animation style, it's really good. But looking back at it, the character animations are really stiff and janky actually. But overall, it's still quite a solid release, and every other aspect of it more than makes up for it. At times, it can feel a bit jarring when it shifts from the live action original recordings to the animation, as it does in, say, The Reign of Terror and the Moon Base. However, it's still a pretty solid animation.
Yeah, exactly. I think, you know, it's great to have it, and it is a great anime. I think it is a very good actual animation. I think there are problems with it, as you mentioned. The characters, some of the character movement is lacking, and I think we can definitely say that that's improved in the years since in the animations we've seen more recently. I think it's always just seemed to be a thing that's very, very difficult to do is realistic character movement in animation. Naturally, that's quite a difficult thing. And that's something that, you know, certainly bears out in this version of Shada, which is somewhat unfortunate. And as you say, the other kind of unique thing to this release really is that constant jumping between live action footage and animation. That, you know, obviously we have classic Who stories that have missing episodes, but you still kind of get that break of, you know, the credits and the title sequence that lead into the animation, rather than literally going from one scene to the next, from animation to the other. I do quite like the way that they kind of start off by flowing into the animation, because obviously we start with live action footage, and I think it's 5 minutes or so in, it kind of pans up. We pan up to the sky, I think it's something along the lines of that, and then it kind of changes to the animation. You almost don't realize in that moment that it's changed to animation. Then it brings it down into an animated, Cambridge, and it's sort of that. It's a very clever way of starting us off on animation and not giving a really jarring feel to it. I always remember that. I always felt that was a very clever way of starting it off. And introducing us to animation in this, which is always going to be it's going to be good, but it's going to be the slightly less good part of it, I guess. It's interesting to see, but really, you were always waiting to get back to the live action footage, because the animation is always going to be slightly inferior. Ryan, how did you find it? How did you find it jarring when it was jumping from animation to live action, or was it reasonably well kind of constructed to flow fairly well?
Well, when I first heard about this, I was wondering how they were going to pull this off, that sort of blend between live action and animation. But once I got accustomed to it, after I first saw it, I think it wasn't quite as jarring to me watching it because I think I grew accustomed to it after a while as you're watching it. And I think what really helped was the fact that it wasn't split into 6 parts. It was done as one big movie version in this, which I think helped it somewhat. So I think it might have been a little bit jarring if it was split into the 6-part format. But I think because it's edited together as like this big 2.5-hour movie, it does help it. I mean, some of the character animations are a little a bit stiff, but I definitely think they did a solid job with the animation overall. I mean, I think it's the same production company that did Power of the Daleks the year before that, and it was the first version of Power of the Daleks. And I think this was definitely a step up from that version. I mean, as much as there were times when the character movements were a bit stiff, it was nowhere near as very stiff or cardboardy or wooden as the first version of Power of the Daleks was a lot of the time. So I feel like it definitely felt like a step in the right direction. I think you can clearly see in Shada, there was definitely a step into the right direction, as it would continue later on in Macra Terror, Faceless Ones, and hopefully in Evil of the Daleks as well for this production company.
Indeed, exactly. I think well, you open a whole can of worms when it comes to the omnibus version of Shada. I've read many a page of angry fans on the forums, unhappy that this is not a 6-part version. It was never meant to be a movie. It was meant to be 6 individual episodes. Why did you not give us a 6-part version? And of course, the question is, will we get a 6-part version on the collection release? I don't know, is the answer to that. I think the only disadvantage I find to the omnibus version, I definitely agree with you, Ryan, that it helps the flow of it by not having credits in there and just breaking things up and all of that when you've got this jumping from animation to live action. The only difficult thing is that there's no stopping point if you don't want to watch the whole thing in one go, because obviously you get so accustomed to, with longer Doctor Who stories, having that kind of, the end of episode 3, okay, I'll take a break, I'll come back and watch the next hour of it another time or whatever. But because it's just 2 hours 20 all in, you very much feel like you've got to sit down and watch the whole thing, I find. Which, it's great fun. It is good, but I just feel like there's probably a market for that. And I wouldn't be surprised if they chose to do an episodic version on the collection, albeit that would be a bit messy probably. They'd have to figure out how to, tidy up create cliffhangers, tidy up the music cues, all that kind of thing. Albeit that's pretty not difficult because, of course, the music was done by Mark Ayres, who's basically the guy behind, the restoration of all the audio and everything for the collection, and does all the 5.1 mixes and is just amazing. He's an incredible man when it comes to audio for Doctor Who. And he obviously he wanted to do a score that was very much in the style of Dudley Simpson, because it would have been Dudley Simpson who would have done a score for this if it had been done at the time. Unlike, as we said earlier, the Kev McCulloch version, which really didn't suit it quite as well at all. And it's just, he obviously used as kind of the basis for a cue, the very sort of popular, well-known cue from City of Death, that sort of piano-y cue when the Doctor and Romana are exploring Paris and all of that. And I think that was a very clever idea to kind of just trying to come up with a musical idea to work with, basically, of using that as a sort of base cue. I think for the story was really, really effective, and gave it a real theme to it and a feeling. And I definitely do, as much as I think there's probably more music in there than you would have got in a normal story from that period of the show. It does feel like the soundtrack is longer and there's more music in scenes, I think, than what I feel like I'm used to from 70s Who. But I still think actually that score itself does work really, really effectively in just bringing the animation together and, well, the whole product together, because then you've got music that plays through animation and live action sequences, and it kind of just helps the whole flow of the story, I think. I don't know, Charlie, what's your kind of take on the soundtrack to this? Do you think it suits well? How do you think it kind of, ties the whole thing together?
The soundtrack is actually really nice. Obviously, it's much better than the like you said, the Seventh Doctor reminiscent soundtrack from before, which really didn't suit it at all. They're opposite eras of the show, pretty much. Maybe not opposite, but still. And the soundtrack does work for the omnibus version. However, the sound would, like you said, have to be tidied up for the collection release, hopefully, if they do split it into 6 parts, which I would advise. And the question is as well, with the season 17 collection release, how many versions of Shada are they going to do? Because they could add all of them onto here if they really wanted,
Yeah,
I mean, I think they might put the Paul McGann version on, if they do like a Wilderness Years collection, they might save it for that, considering it's Paul McGann's Doctor. But I wouldn't be surprised if they managed to find some way of squeezing it into the season 17 collection. And I will say on top of that, as we've had many different versions of Shada, I would say City of Death and all the versions of Shada, regardless of what anyone may think about any specific version, is a million times better than the rest of season 17, quite frankly.
Indeed. Yes, it's it's a step up on the likes of Nightmare of Eden, Creature from the Pit, and the Horns of Nimon. They're not, well. Charlie, do you want to quickly share your opinion on season 17? Because I believe you're more of a fan.
I will admit, I don't really like the Creature from the Pit, and I can't really remember the ones of Nimon. I do have a soft spot for Nightmare of Eden, and again with Destiny of the Daleks, and obviously City of Death and Shada are brilliant. But I just do really like the overall tone of Graham Williams' era in general. I always think it's been very underrated. Maybe not on the level of the Hinchcliffe era, but certainly better than the JNT era, in my opinion. It just has such a charm and a wit. Tom Baker is on top form, and at times I do think it's just more fun and carefree than the Hinchcliffe era is, with its dark and gothic tone. So yeah, season 17 in general, while it may not have the best stories, I'd say it has the best overall sort of tone and atmosphere.
Well, funnily enough, in regards to season 17, it's one of the seasons my dad absolutely adores because of how hilariously shoddy it is. We both find huge entertainment out of it, whether it's Davros bobbing up and down like a rubber duck in a bathtub in Destiny of the Daleks, or obviously Creature from the Pit, and that infamous scene of Tom Baker trying to communicate with the Typhonian, resulting in one of the most infamous scenes of all time. That will
indeed
never stick with us forever, which I'm pretty sure Tom Baker ad-libbed on purpose. Someone will probably correct me on that, but I'm pretty sure Tom Baker must have ad-libbed that. I'm sure of it. And then, of course, with Hordes of Nimon, my dad always said that Graham Crowden made that story for him. That Graham Crowden obviously played one of the most laughably ridiculous villains in Doctor history. And all I can say about Hordes of Nimon is, when it got to that cliffhanger at the end of part 1, when that planet that looked like a crunched up, rolled up dog biscuit hurtling towards them, and Tom Baker saying to K9, "It's coming right for us," and he's clutching K9's head in mock terror. I just remember putting my heads in my hands and just going, well, if the fate of the entire universe was in the hands of these two buggers, then God help us all.
Indeed, exactly.
And I think it's pretty much shows that the writing was on the wall for Tom Baker back then.
Yes.
And considering, and some people have even regarded Hordes of Nimon as the worst Tom Baker story, which I don't know if I'd agree with that, but you can definitely understand why, because of how infamous it is.
I feel like The Horns of Nimon is maybe the worst Tom Baker story, but it's not the least entertaining Tom Baker story. I'd say Underworld, for example, is definitely a worse story. Like, I can still sit and thoroughly enjoy Horns of Nimon because it is so hilariously bad and over the top and ridiculous. Whereas a story like Underworld is just really quite dull and bad and boring. So I think, yeah, I can understand people's thoughts of that, but I enjoy Horns of Nimon as much as it's pretty awful. It's fun.
Well, funny enough, and both of those stories have a bit of a Greek mythology undertone to them, which
Indeed,
is
yes.
and by the same writer, so connection there possibly.
And then you have Time Monster, which isn't exactly the best of Pertwee.
Well, indeed.
No, it's definitely the worst Pertwee story with its infamous time flow analog sequence in the middle of it, which added nothing to the story whatsoever. It was just a very silly, stupid moment in Doctor Who history that still makes me laugh to this day.
Yeah.
Which, if people want to check out that story, the time flow analog scene will leave you speechless because of how pointless it is and how unbelievably stupid it is at the same time.
Yeah.
But with Shada, at least, regardless of the quality of all of these season 17 stories, at least all the versions of Shada were at least a step up from that, which is surprising why Douglas Adams was not particularly happy with it. He has stated since in the Doctor Who magazine interview that he said he thought, this is, and I quote, he said, "I didn't particularly like it. It was rather thin. At most, a mediocre 4-part story stretched over 6 parts. So when it was cancelled halfway through production, I thought, phew, because I thought it wasn't very good. And now at least I'm spared anybody seeing it." So it was very surprising that he actually did say that. I didn't think it was like shoddy. I think there have definitely been shoddy stories, and maybe it was because of the fact that it was part of season 17 and the fact that production got halted halfway through, that maybe that's why he doesn't particularly think highly of it. But personally for me, I feel like it was at least, along with City of Death, a step up from the weaker stories, particularly from that Graham Williams period of the show.
Yeah, it does. I feel with Shada that it's a story that has kind of been elevated in its sort of, status, or it's become in people's minds a better story than maybe it is, just because of everything that's happened around it, because it was this great, and I feel like that's sometimes happens with missing stories. I mean, I feel like it's only really ever gone the other way so far with, say, Enemy of the World, that everybody thought was a bit terrible and actually it was brilliant. I feel like with Shada, people, always kind of thought of it, oh, it's this lost classic, it's written by Douglas Adams, it's got to be amazing, it's got a Time Lord in it and all this. And I by no means think it's a bad story. I do think it's, thoroughly entertaining. It's very, very Douglas Adams. It's, lots of humour in there and it's good fun. But I don't, necessarily think it's one of, the great Doctor Who stories. Like, I feel some people have kind of built it up to be nowadays. And I think when you really, you sit and watch that 2017 animation version properly and really think about it, you'll go, yeah, it's a solid piece of Doctor Who, but it's not an all-time classic, which I feel like before that, people kind of thought of it as that was the case. I don't know, Charlie, where do you stand on that?
I do really like Shada, but yeah, I do agree, Elliot. It seems it's fans' view of it seems to have been elevated quite a lot by its legacy. The amount of releases it's had, obviously it's very infamous.
Yes.
Although I do think it's really good. It's probably Douglas Adams' weakest. Like, I do really enjoy the Pirate Planet in City of Death.
Yeah.
Is obviously City of Death rarely doesn't reach top tens. It's just an absolute classic. Pirate Planet is always up there. Not many people dislike Pirate Planet, I'd say. But
Exactly.
yeah, Shada is still a solid one, but it's not brilliant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I absolutely agree. I think it is, of the 3 Douglas Adams scripts, it is definitely his weakest, although I still think it's a solid story. But yeah, City of Death is definitely a classic. Will always be his masterpiece. And Pirate Planet, I actually think, is the best story of the Key to Time season. I absolutely
exactly
had
what I was
a
going to
lot
say.
of fun with Pirate Planet. It's such a really good story, and it's it almost made my top list of favorite stories ever, because I think it's such an absolute great story. The humor's brilliant. Tom Baker on absolute top form, just commanding every scene he's in. It's absolutely brilliant. And so yeah, even though I do think Douglas Adams maybe as a script editor isn't one of the best, as a writer, I think he's contributed some pretty solid stories in Classic Who.
Yeah, I do think that Douglas Adams' 3 scripts for Doctor Who, as you say, are very, go from good to really, really great. I don't think, he didn't do a bad one, really. Shada's the weakest, but it's still not a bad story. I think, as you say, Ryan, maybe his script editing abilities weren't quite as good. And I feel like he just maybe didn't strike the right balance between kind of humor and seriousness in terms of the stories that we see in season 17, for example. It just feels like sometimes it's a little bit too ridiculous, too silly, a bit too much, sciencey gobbledygook comedy lines almost in there that Douglas Adams, but often in his own scripts work quite effectively because he knows kind of how to write. It's all within the whole story, but when he's just kind of chucking those lines, I think, in when he's producing his script edited some of the other stories, I don't think it just works quite as well ultimately. So I do think that he has his good and his bad points as a script editor and as a writer for Doctor Who. But of course, one of the last things we should talk about in regards to the 2017 version of Shada is the, in many ways, quite surprising appearance of Tom Baker at the end of the story that we certainly weren't expecting. That was something that obviously wasn't, I'm pretty certain wasn't announced at the time. Like the initial announcement of Shada, they didn't announce that Tom was going to be a part of it, and that he was going to, be physically in the story at the end of it. I do remember actually at this time I was working at the BBC for on a Radio 4 program called Front Row, and I actually got the email with the press release the day before it was announced. So I actually did find the news a day in advance of everybody else. I got the press release going, Tom Baker's back on screen as the Doctor for the first time in however long. I guess he's kind of the Doctor in Day of the Doctor, but also not really. So it's a really quite fun and cool and surreal moment, I think, to see Tom turn up again as the Doctor in Shada. Yes, it doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense, but I still think it's a really fun, nice scene to end on. What is extremely likely to be the last time he plays the Doctor on screen. That it's a pretty significant moment. It's highly unlikely we'll ever see him actually play the role in on TV. So it feels like a really significant moment, and just to see his his sort of chuckle and smile at the end of the story is just brilliant. I think it's definitely one of my favorite parts of this release. I think. Charlie, what did you think of having Tom turn up right at the end?
It really caught me off guard. I wasn't. I'd never really seen any reviews as to watching this story because I didn't watch it until must have been early 2019 at the time. It was definitely a good couple of years after its release, and I just thought, hang on, that's Tom Baker as the Doctor. That's it just really. I will admit I was losing interest towards the end because it was sort of a 4-parter stretched across 6, and then I sort of just my attention just went back up as I heard Tom Baker, like, hang on a minute. And yeah, I think it will go down in Doctor Who history if that is his last appearance as the Doctor, unless he comes back in the 60th, which he might, but maybe is just a minor role like the curator.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Ryan, did you enjoy seeing Tom's probably final appearance as the Doctor?
Yeah, it kind of got to it. In a way, it was a bit of a special time because it came out shortly before Peter Capaldi's last episode of Doctor Who Twice Upon a Time. And I always think of Tom Baker and Peter Capaldi as my joint favourite Doctors of all time. Mm-hmm. And so seeing what is likely Tom Baker's last ever appearance as the Doctor, and also maybe likely Peter Capaldi's last appearance as the Doctor, back. It kind of got to me because I'm like, I'm saying goodbye to my 2 favorite Doctors on screen, and so that moment at the end of Shada, it was definitely very welcome for me, considering someone as Tom Baker was my first Doctor and was my gateway into the show. It was definitely a special moment for me. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. It does feel a very it does feel a very significant moment. I think a very special moment, a real treat for us fans, but also very special. And just, they'd really taken the time and the attention to detail with that scene. They'd obviously got, like the original set, the original cameras. They'd very much gone all in to make this look like a part of the story, but also, just really playing into that. And I do think it's a wonderful way to most likely say goodbye to Tom in Doctor Who, as much as it isn't its last story. And when you watch it in a marathon or whatever, you've obviously got what's to come, but so we all know obviously the backstory to that. And so I don't think there's a better way they could have ended that version of Shada than that, to be honest. I really think that it couldn't, no bit of animation could have done better than that moment. So I think that will always be a very special moment for us as fans to be able to look back on, really. And so that kind of brings us to our journey to an end with Shada. As we mentioned, I guess the only real future release of Shada is going to be, well, when the season 17 version of the collection range comes out. The possibility of an episodic version, maybe, but ultimately this is probably the final real version of Shada that we're going to get. I guess it's kind of an obvious question, but do you think this is the best version? Is this the definitive version of Shada? What do you think, Ryan?
Absolutely. I think the 2017 version is, for me, the definitive version of Shada. Although, bear in mind, I've yet to read the novelization, and who knows, maybe that opinion could change. Maybe it would feel much more streamlined and more focused in the novelization, that maybe it wasn't in the TV version, but the 2017 version will always be the version of Shada that I will always go to, and it provides the more fitting end to season 17 than perhaps not Horns of Nimon did.
Indeed, exactly. Yes, I mean, having recently watched season 17 as part of my marathon, it was so nice to watch the Horns of Nimon and then not realise, oh, now we're moving on to 80s Who. Actually, here is Shada, the proper, as much as a proper version we're going to get of Shada to watch. Albeit watching it in that context, it still does feel like a little bit its own thing. Like, I think just having that animation, which in many ways is so out of place with that era of Doctor Who, you kind of get used to almost watching animated episodes in the 60s when you're watching 60s Who, but to see that as part of a one-off within this, it did very much, I kind of watching it, it felt like a halfway between the season 17 Williams era and season 18 and John Nathan Turner. It felt like it was kind of almost bridging the gap rather than being very much a season 17 story, sort of watching it all in context for the rest of it around it. That was just the sort of way it struck me. But Charlie, do you see this as the greatest version of Shada?
Yeah, I do agree with both of you. It is, yeah, like if I were to watch it in a marathon context, I would absolutely watch this because it's arguably the most accurate and complete version we have of Shada. Yeah. However, if say I wanted just for some reason one day to watch to listen to the animation or watch listen to the Big Finish audiobook sort of thing, then I probably would. But that would be if I just wanted to listen to that rather than, like I said, in a marathon context. Obviously, my opinion may change if I get the book. Who knows? Because I can imagine I'll be a fan of that, considering it will have more time to delve into the plot, beyond just 2.5 hours. But yeah, for now, I do think that the 2017 animation is the definitive version.
Exactly, indeed it is. That's certainly, I think, the consensus here. As much as it's been a fun journey from, linking narration to Paul McGann versions to unofficial animations, I feel we've pretty much arrived at the ultimate version of Shada. As we say, it may be slightly expanded into maybe an episodic version for the collection release, but I think ultimately this is really the final step for Shada, and I think that's fine. That's great, I think, because we finally can enjoy that story in the closest we're going to ever get to what it was originally intended to be, and I think that's a really great thing. And of course, it's something we're exploring with our missing episodes being animated as well. It all plays into getting a more complete version of the whole of Doctor Who, the whole of classic Doctor Who, and getting us closer and closer to that step. And Shada was a big sort of gap that was trying to be filled over and over but couldn't quite, and now it finally has been. So I hope that you've all listening have enjoyed us chatting about Shada. If you do want to, if you're watching on YouTube, please put in the comments what your opinions on the different versions of Shada. If you've got a soft spot for the Ian Levine animation, or the Paul McGann version. Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you about your thoughts and opinions on Shada as a story, and also with the various versions of it as well. So, of course, coming up, we've got a couple of new animations to look forward to as well. We've spoken about it previously, but just a quick reminder that on the 16th of August, which hopefully should be about a week away when you listen to this, is The Web of Fear, the story we've been waiting for a very, very long time when they announced it on Doctor Who Day last year. It's been, 10 months since they announced it. And then we saw the rather concerning clip a couple of months ago. You guys filmed with any more optimism? Are you looking forward to the Web of Fear animation?
We shall wait and see. That's all I can do. We shall wait and see. Who knows? Maybe that could change before then, but yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting when looking at that episode in its entirety.
Indeed. I'm sure it's going to provide good discussion on this podcast. We're definitely going to be able to have a good chat about that animation afterwards, I sense, based on what we've seen so far. Charlie, is that a release as a whole that you're looking forward to as well?
As for the Web of Fear, I'd say I'm more excited for the documentary as to the making of the animation, rather than the animation itself, just to see how they did it and what their thought process was making that very questionable animation. But right now, most of my hype as such is probably for Evil of the Daleks rather than the Web of Fear.
Indeed, yes. Evil of the Daleks is, of course, the next animation, which is coming up on the 27th of September. So that's only about 5-6 weeks as well. It's pretty exciting, really, that in just over the space of a month, we've got 2 new animations coming up. I guess, well, that's 7 episodes that are missing being animated and released in the space of a month is really quite exciting. And we're pretty confident that Galaxy 4 and the Abominable Snowmen are coming at some point as well. We based on the hints and the leaks, we can be pretty damn confident those are coming. So there is lots more to come in the animation world as well. I mean, Evil of the Daleks, I think it's going to be brilliant, isn't it? I mean, the animation looks good based on the brief that we've seen, and it's just a cracking story that I cannot wait to see in its entirety, because I feel it's a story that I've always found a bit difficult to really connect with and enjoy in reconstruction form. And so to get that full animation, I think is going to make such a difference to the story. I mean, Charlie, you mentioned particularly looking forward to that one. What are you most looking forward to about Evil of the Daleks?
Just the fact that we'll get to see it complete, really. Obviously, it's always deemed from, I think it was my granddad who actually said that he watched Patrick Troughton and he remembers Evil of the Daleks quite fondly. So I am really, really looking forward to just actually managing to see the closest thing we'll ever get to all 7 episodes of Evil of the Daleks. Like, obviously supposed to be very epic and grandiose, like the end of the Daleks. So that'll be really cool to see.
Yeah, exactly. Ryan, are you excited to finally see this big, exciting 7-part Dalek story in Evil of the Daleks?
Absolutely. I've always said it's one of the best of the 60s. It's definitely one of Troughton's best. Having listened to the audio, I'm very excited to see how it's going to translate, and I'm happy that it's done by the same people who did the new Shada, the updated Power of the Daleks, and of course Makrito and the Faceless Ones, which I think are the best animations, and hopefully it's also a little bit of a step up from that, and we could end up getting the best animation to date. I'm hoping it'll be, because I think this is definitely the story that absolutely deserves that treatment, and I just can't wait to see how it all turns out.
Yeah, definitely everything's playing towards it being the best animation so far, I'd say. As you say, it's probably the strongest animation team in terms of the type of animation we've seen previously. They've gained their experience. I think, quite frankly, Daleks really lend themselves to animation. I think having a Dalek story with lots of Daleks in is probably easier and just works better in animation form than a lot of, moving characters as such. So we discussed the issues of that previously. So I'm really, really hopeful that this story will get the animation it really, really deserves. But apart from that, there isn't a lot else to come at the moment, unfortunately. We're still waiting for another collection box set to be announced. I think last time we said, was it season 16 and 17 were the ones we were most interested in? I don't think there's much in the way of rumours, quite frankly, at the moment. I know season 20 has been rumoured for about the last 2 years, but apart from that, it's all a little bit barren as to what's going to be coming next. We know they're being worked on. They are happening. It's all coming. My guess would be, I don't know if you guys agree, my guess would be we'll get one more release this year. I think we'll get something, a collection box set in maybe October, November time would be the most likely. I think the people behind it have talked about how 3 releases a year is probably the most realistic thing they're going to achieve sort of going forwards. That, to really bring the quality that we want, 3 a year is most likely. And obviously we had season 8 in March, season 24 in June, so I guess September or October sounds about the time for a season something release to come out, whatever that may be. I don't know, have you had any more thoughts, guys, on what you'd like to see next, or any particular stories you'd like to see sort of get the treatment?
I mean, I have a feeling it's the fact that we haven't had much news. I wouldn't be surprised if they save it to like the 11th hour at beginning of December. I mean, I think they did that once before with season 19 back in the day. It was like,
yes, it was, wasn't it? Yeah, it was.
I wouldn't be surprised if they pull the same move here. I wouldn't mind seeing one of the Tom Baker seasons next. I mean, I would like to see season 13, but that's obviously because I'm a huge fan of the first 3 seasons of Tom Baker and that Golden Age. So obviously I would love to see that given the Blu-ray treatment. And yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing the Key to Time season 16, because even though I'm not a huge fan of the last 2 stories, Power of Quarrel, Armageddon Factor, I absolutely love those first 4 stories from the Reboss Operation all the way through to Androids of Tara. I think they're just such fun stories that I just have fun rewatching again and again and again. They're just the perfect Doctor Who entertainment for me. So yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing that given the collection.
I would say that they've got the perfect marketing opportunity at the moment, as they can market it as the original 6-story season arc Doctor Who season, as season 13 is going to be a 6-episode season arc. They can market it off the back of that as the original version. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's it could be a good marketing opportunity, if nothing else. What about you, Charlie? Is there any in particular you're excited for?
As for season 20, the rumors, I can't say I'm excited for it. It's not a brilliant season. But according to the current pattern, then the except besides season 19, then the trailer for it, the announcement, is usually anywhere from 3 to 4 months before.
Yes.
So I would expect one maybe the middle of this month to be released, maybe in like late mid-November to early December, I'd guess.
Yeah.
As for the ones that I think are realistic, season 20 would be the obvious choice. If not, I would say 25, but we've just had 24. So in that case, maybe season 9, possibly.
Yeah.
That's always
an option as well.
Yeah, I think those are reasonable options. I mean, season 9 is a pretty good, strong John Pertwee season, even if the Time Monster is easily the weakest of the John Pertwee era. I mean, I wouldn't mind. The other stories are really good, so I wouldn't mind seeing that. Season 20, I can definitely understand, because some of the stories in that season are not good. But I absolutely adore Enlightenment. I think that's one of the best 80s stories, so I wouldn't mind getting a Blu-ray of that season just for that story. And of course, the 5 Doctors.
Yeah.
It's the 20th anniversary, so I mean, there are some good stories, even if overall it is a bit of a mixed bag.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So there's lots of good possibilities. I think always the other question is if and when we'll get a black and white season of the collection range as well. I'm sure we're due one at some point. The most obvious candidates would be, I guess, season 2 or season 6, with only the 2 episodes of the Crusades for season 2 that are non-animated, and the 5 episodes of the Space Pirates that aren't animated for season 6. And at some point, realistically, they're going to have to release the collections for the black and white era before they are fully animated, because that's just not going to happen in time. So it'll just be interesting to see when they do it and how they tackle it. And there's a lot of episodes in those seasons. Is the challenge as well? Getting enough discs in these box sets, because some of them have got 9, 10 stories in them, and some of them are 7-parters, 12-parters in Darling Master Plan's case. So actually spreading them across enough discs is probably going to be a bit of a challenge as well, I imagine. So that'll be something interesting to look to if and when we get that in the future. But well, we will have to wait and see. You never know. This podcast might be out of date if on Monday when we post this suddenly they've already announced a new one. Who knows? But Maybe not. Maybe not. We'll have to wait and see on that, won't we? But that pretty much wraps us up for this edition of KerVAM. We're going to be taking a few weeks break, mainly because I'm getting married, so I haven't got as much time to do it. And so we'll be back sometime in September, certainly to discuss the Web of Fear animation. We'll all, I'm sure, have had a chance to watch it, to really dissect that animation that we're not very optimistic for, but also discuss the documentaries and the special features to come in that as well, and probably have a little more of a preview of Evil of the Daleks as well. But apart from that, as always, please do check us out on Twitter at KerVAMPod if you aren't already following us over there. And of course, if you're listening on YouTube, you can also check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Or if you're listening over there, you can go check us out on YouTube as well, at EMS Productions, or just search KerVAM on YouTube as well. But apart from that, I hope you guys enjoyed this week's podcast, and we will see you all again soon. Goodbye!